We end today's episode with the death of a single man. He was born Joel Haglund, but history remembers him by his chosen name, Joe Hill. Arriving in America from Sweden, he was the third of 9 children whose father was a train conductor. When his father died young, the Haglund family was at the precipice of financial disaster. But Joe's mother managed to keep their heads above water until her untimely death in Joe's early 20s. Having few prospects and almost laid low by tuberculosis in Sweden, Joe and his brother left for America in either 1901 or 1902. He traveled the country, likely riding the rails, and found himself in San Francisco when the great earthquake ripped apart whole city blocks in 1906. He found work after the quake at a rope factory. At around the same time, he changed his name, perhaps to escape the blacklist. In 1910, he became a dues-paying member of the IWW and participated in the aforementioned Fresno and San Diego free speech strikes. It was during these strikes, and with the IWW, that Joe Hill discovered his true calling, songwriting. He took to the practice quickly and wrote labor songs which are still sung today in union halls across the country. Workers of the World Awaken, There is Power in a Union, and Union Made are but a few of the classic songs written to the popular music of Joe Hill's time. They all follow a pro-union and anti-capitalist message, which was common for most Wobblies to preach. In truth, Joe Hill was amongst a number of, quote, hobo folk composers, unquote, who would go on to inspire folk artists like Woody Guthrie, Pete Seeger, and eventually Bob Dylan. What made Joe Hill famous was the circumstances of his death. On January 10, 1914, John and Arling Morrison were shot dead in a botched robbery. Merlin Morrison, the surviving 13-year-old son of John, claimed the killers entered his father's house shouting, quote, "We've got you now," unquote. No money or valuables were stolen, and no murder weapon was ever discovered. However, before being killed, Arling Morrison managed to return fire and strike one of his assassins. That same night, Joe Hill was in the local hospital seeking treatment for a gunshot wound in his shoulder. Hill claimed he was shot over a quarrel with a woman whose name Joe Hill refused to give for the sake of her quote-unquote honor. This lack of any clear alibi was all Utah authorities needed to arrest and charge the Wobbly with the double murder. Unfortunately for the authorities, Joe Hill had only just arrived, so he had no motive, and the evidence was highly circumstantial. But due to the charged climate of the time, the authorities believed they had found the perfect foreigner scapegoat. Joe Hill now had to prove his innocence to escape conviction. Hill tried to make the trial about the facts instead of a witch hunt against supposed Wobblies, going as far as asking the Union to stop raising money for his defense. Leftists and moderate Union supporters threw their weight behind Hill in the effort to get him acquitted. In Hill's words, quote, "I have no desire to be one of them martyrs. On the square, I'll tell you that this notoriety stuff is making me dizzy in the head, and I am afraid I'm getting more glory than I really am entitled to," unquote. His execution date neared, and desperate leftists like Elizabeth Gurley Flynn attempted to appeal to President Wilson directly. For his part, Wilson attempted to get Utah authorities to halt the executions not once but twice, but these attempts were rebuked. Hill wrote a final letter to Big Bill Haywood, who was still doing everything in his power to prevent Hill's execution. In the letter it says, quote, "Goodbye, Bill. I will die like a true blue rebel. Don't waste any time in mourning. Organize," unquote. His final request was to be cremated outside of state lines, writing, quote, "I don't want to be found dead in Utah," unquote. A final will, written in verse, was discovered in Joe Hill's prison cell following his death by firing squad. It reads, quote, "My will is easy to decide, for there is nothing to divide. My kin don't need to fuss and moan. Moss does not cling to a rolling stone. My body, oh, if I could choose, I would to ashes it reduce, and let the merry breezes blow my dust to where some flowers grow. Perhaps some fading flower then would come to life and bloom again. This is my last and final will. Good luck to all of you, Joe Hill." Unquote. With respect to his final wishes, Joe Hill's remains were sent to Chicago. The labor agitator and songwriter was cremated after being murdered for a crime he probably did not commit. The remains were then sent across the country in 600 individual envelopes and released together. One envelope was confiscated by the U.S. Postal Service as the employees worried of the incendiary effect it would have. The last of Joe Hill's remains would remain under government safeguard until the late 1980s, when members of the IWW finally received his ashes, but not the envelope in which they came. In 1990, the last of Joe Hill's ashes were scattered in a remote location in southern Michigan, but not before several wobblies ingested some of the remains. Whether Joe Hill's remains helped some feeble flower to bloom remains unknown. But his sacrifice and the sacrifice of thousands of American workers during this era brought new weight to the new labor movement.